Good morning. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and we are very pleased to be teaming with our partners in the Office of Transit this morning to bring you a webinar on transit performance management and STIP TIP coordination. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are attempting to record this webinar, and if we are successful, we will post it and provide a link to the Office of Transit that they can share with everyone who's on the webinar later, hopefully today. Also, on your screen, you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner, hopefully, you see a chat pod. When you joined the webinar, you joined actually in a muted stage, but you're more than welcome to enter questions you have in the chat pod during the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will unmute everyone on their line so they can ask questions through the phone. But while the presentation's occurring, we do request that you please enter any questions you have in the chat pod. And we have someone monitoring that'll be reading them to the presenters. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our presentation team. Are you there, team?
We are.
Great. I'll let you guys do introductions. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. We appreciate your assistance here. My name is Dave Moore. I work in the ODOT Office of Statewide Planning and Research, and I'm here with a number of colleagues around the room. We're not going to necessarily introduce each and every one of us, but my colleagues here are from the Office of Transit and from the Office of Program Management. ODOT invited you to this webinar because we will need to coordinate our collective efforts related to the Federal Performance Management Transit Asset Management Plan and State of Good Repair targets. We have a really pretty short presentation today for you. This is not really going to be a primer on transit asset management plans or State of Good Repair targeting. What this webinar is really going to focus on is the coordination among ODOT, the MPOs, and the transit agencies related to transit asset management plans and State of Good Repair targets, and in particular, the planning documentation that MPOs need to produce that will enable us to continue to advance new or amended projects through the current State Transportation Improvement Program. And that's really going to be the theme of our session, and you're going to hear this a couple of times. I'm going to be a bit of a broken record. ODOT's principal interest in this effort is, again, to maintain our ability to finance new and amended projects through the Ohio STIP TIP. Leading to that, we need to focus on a couple of things. We're going to focus on the asset management plans and the State of Good Repair targets, the MPO's responses to the transit agency's State of Good Repair targets, and then again the planning documentation that MPOs need to put together related to the transportation improvement programs for each of the MPO regions. What we really want to do here is we want to first of all look at the roles and responsibilities for our respective agencies. Transit agencies are establishing, again, State of Good Repair targets, and they are also responsible for developing transit asset management plans. MPOs then, in turn, establish regional State of Good Repair targets, and they provide planning documentation for the regions addressing how the MPOs are working with the transit agencies and DOTs to advance those planning targets, the State of Good Repair targets. Now, it's interesting because MPOs have the opportunity to directly adopt the transit agency's State of Good Repair targets, or they can establish their own regional targets. We think and so there's a lot of coordination that needs to go forward, between the transit agencies, the MPOs, and ODOT. And we think a good example of the coordination that needs to go forward is the NOACA model. There are 5 transit agencies within the NOACA MPO planning boundary. And then in Geauga County, ODOT serves as a Tier 2 state of good repair sponsor for Geauga, and then NWACA is also a direct recipient for 5310 FTA dollars. So there's 5 sets of performance management targets related to transit, plus NWACA's, plus ODOT's. And somehow NWACA needs to tie all these together into a regional view. ODOT, again, and then just as I indicated previously, ODOT serves as a Tier 2 sponsor for many of the smaller transit agencies, and then ODOT is also your principal contact with USDOT for STIP TIP documentation. The STIP TIP documentation, of course, being our collective ability to finance FTA and federal highway projects in Ohio. And then lastly, the roles and responsibilities for each of us here in Ohio is to make sure that we are coordinating and collaborating with one another on all of these processes. The need to, hopefully this slide here will demonstrate clearly why we need to begin coordination. January 1, 2017, transit agencies were required to establish their initial state of good repair targets. July 1st, 2017, MPOs then were to respond to state of good repair targets for their region based on what the transit agencies had established. Now, we here at the department clearly understand that maybe not all transit agencies and not all MPOs actually acted on the January 1st or July 1st, 2017 targets that were due, and that is not necessarily a problem at the moment. In our work with FTA, we understand that FTA is going to assume a self-certification monitoring process for the transit agencies and the MPO's responses to these targets. And their self-certification process is going to really be realized and monitored more directly through either FTA triennial reviews or MPO certification reviews. So we have time to catch up, if you will, on these state of good repair targets. Now, interestingly, there's a convergence of regulations that are going to take place all on October 1st. The transit asset management plans are due on October 1st, and then interestingly, effective October 1st, TIP amendments cannot be approved for new or amended project until the MPO TIPs reflect the transit TAM and the state of good repair outcomes for their regions. And essentially, this is the TIP planning documentation that MPOs need to put together. And that planning documentation is, in effect, a summary of the region's status related to state of good repair targets and asset management plans. And then the third activity that's going to take place on October 1st is ODOT submits its quarterly STIP amendment. So you can see there's a convergence of requirements that all need to take place effective October 1st. And in order for the MPOs to be prepared to provide their documentation for that October 1st date, we all need to be talking now. Now, the planning documentation that I'm referencing is related to the MPO's TIPs. And these bullet points are a real short summary of what the MPOs need to put together. They need to provide a description of the anticipated effect of the TIP toward achieving the TAM targets, and then the recommended documentation is to identify the respective transit TAM targets or the MPO targets, a narrative describing how the TIP projects will contribute to a target achievement, and then TIP consistency with a series of planning documents that the MPOs develop for their region. The State Highway Safety Plan, the CMAQ performance plan, the congestion management plan, etc. And if you would like to review more information on what this planning documentation should look like, you can reference that website on the bottom bullet here. Next slide, please. Now, following FTA's self-certification approach on meeting all this regulatory environment, the ODOT Office of Transit is going, after this webinar, is going to send out a certification sheet, I don't know what to call it other than that, to each of the transit agencies that includes these bullet points. Again, this is just following FTA's self-certification model. We want the transit agencies to certify that they are in fact developing state of good repair targets. They are developing a transit asset management plan, and that they are assisting the MPOs in putting together the TIP documentation that is needed for the October 1st deadline. So I'm going to now ask Chuck Dyer, our Administrator of Transit, just to add any comments on this certification that I missed.
Correct, Dave. This is following FTA's way of doing business through a self-certification process. ODOT will be completing these forms for the MPOs where we have projects and Tier 2 group plan MPOs that need to be included with our information, so we'll be sending this out as well. We have completed a short narrative, and we have, as a state, we do have our example put together. So if a transit agency is looking for some technical assistance on what to put together for the MPOs, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office. And I'm going to just encourage that everyone fills out this form, sends it back to us in the Office of Transit along with the MPO agency that governs your region. And hopefully we won't have a delay in any of our projects, whether it be transit, highway, or whatever it may be, using federal dollars.
And then I'll just add, too, that the MPOs have some familiarity with the type of documentation that is required for this effort because they've just recently finalized this exact same process with respect to the highway safety targets that were developed last May-ish, or before that, I can't remember the exact date. So again, transit agencies look for an email transmittal of this certification sheet from Juana Hostin in the Office of Transit. She'll provide a little bit more direction in the email on how to respond to this certification, and then we'll ask you that you send this back also to the Office of Transit.
Again, this is Chuck. I'm going to chime in one more time. I'm going to recommend that if any agency, whether transit or MPO, has questions and concerns, they start addressing and seeking assistance earlier than later. We want to avoid the situation where we may have a state legislature who calls us wondering why our projects are not being moved forward in a certain region. And it's all following these requirements in the planning process. And so this is ODOT's effort to get in front a little bit and ensure that we are at least providing you some assistance to make sure that that's not the case.
Thank you, Chuck. And again, this is where I become the broken record. I really want to iterate that ODOT's principal interest in this matter is our collective ability to continue to finance federal aid, federal transit projects, federal highway projects through our STIP TIP after October 1st. Unless the MPOs provide this documentation, we cannot advance new projects in the October STIP amendment for your transit agency or for your MPO region. So again, following what Chuck says, we don't want to be responsible for explaining to anyone why we were unable to finance a project. So where we need to be after today is let's all begin talking about transit state of good repair targets, MPO planning documentation, such that the October 1st deadlines can be met. And then, just as we look toward the future, get used to this process. because we're going to go through the exact same thing with the transit safety management plans. That the regs just came out. We haven't thoroughly read them, so I don't exactly know when the targets are due. But when the targets are due, the MPOs will again need to write up narratives about that performance management topic. Do we know the date?
July 19, 2020.
July 19, 2020, safety targets due for 5307 operators, correct?
That's for the agency safety plan.
That's agency, yeah.
Okay, the targets may be actually sooner than that.
All right.
So,
sorry, you can tell I've spent my existence on the highway side. I apologize for that. But again, this was not intended to be a primer for these type of things. We encourage you to touch base with our transit staff for details on asset management plans and state of good repair targets. So at this point, I think we're ready for questions, and we'll see if our collective wisdom can address them.
Okay. We haven't had any come in the chat pod yet, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute all the participants. So if you have a party going on in the background, you might want to tell the folks to tone it down, because in a few seconds here you're going to be unmuted. Okay, I've just unmuted the entire audience. I'll go through and unmute each phone line. You'll have to remute yourself if you don't want to ask questions.
Blair, this is ODOT Central. We will be emailing out the slides.
This is Chuck. Will this same webinar be available to view online later?
As long as the recording is successful. We're hoping it will be.
If it is, we will post it in the Office of Transit for the next month.
I'm almost through unmuting every single line individually. You can always unmute yourself too if you'd like to ask a question. Okay, everybody should pretty well be unmuted here in the next couple seconds. So feel free to ask a question over the phone line if you'd like to. No questions? Going once? Going twice? How can they contact you guys if they have questions after the webinar?
Juana Hodgson will be the main point of contact for the Office of Transit, and the MPOs can continue to reach out to the Office of Statewide Planning and Research.
Okay. What other questions do we have from the audience?
Sorry, this is Curtis from AMAX. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Now.
All right. I just wanted to follow up on a question about regional targets. My understanding is that the MPO is encouraged to have one regional target for if you have multiple transit agencies in your area, but you are allowed to have separate targets per transit agency.
I think that is consistent with the regulatory environment. Yes, Curtis.
Okay, thank you.
Which is why we thought it was interesting to sort of put NOACA's challenges there. The challenge of 5 separate transit agency sets of targets for however many asset classes are required, plus ODOTs for Geauga County, plus NOACA's for 5310. It's a challenging environment to record that many individual targets, but it's similarly a challenging effort to establish regional targets from the individual ones. So, which is really, again, why we are really reiterating the need to begin talking amongst yourselves about what works best for your region.
Thank you.
What other questions do we have from the audience? There was one comment that came in the chat pod that, Chuck, you're a little hard to hear. So if there's any more questions that you're going to respond to, if you'd move closer to the phone, that would be great. right. Well, it sounds like everyone has either gotten all of their questions answered or they want to think about it for a little bit and that they'll be getting back with you guys. So.
And we encourage you to get in touch with the standard ODOT contact that you're comfortable with, if that's the case.
All right. Well, thank you, team, for your presentation this morning. I know you've given everyone a lot to think about, and I'm sure they'll be in touch with questions. Again, as long as the recording was successful, we'll be posting it out through the Office of Transit's website, and we appreciate your time on the webinar this morning. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Appreciate your help.